Being the regular meeting.
Second.
All right, it's been motioned by Ms. Johnson and second by Dr. Shaw. Roll call.
Johnson,
Yeah.
Shaw,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Mo Rogers,
Yes.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes. We'll reconvene at 7:05. And we'll start with our pledge of allegiance, which Dr. Sandra Shimon Rogers is going to lead us.
I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Start with our public hearing concerning emergency e-learning. All right, no one? All right, so I'm just gonna be
And just to
closing.
check the audience, is anybody here to speak about emergency e-learning? Just to make sure.
So I just close this public, on this, I'm sorry, I'm just closing then the public hearing concerning the emergency e-learning, and that is again at 7:06. All right, moving on to our agenda, we have no resolutions, no student government, no AFT report. The IASB report, Ms. Luann Johnson, do you have anything?
Nothing new, unless you know something.
No, nothing new with IASB. COSFA had its second annual conference. I believe that was in Washington DC. Triple I is, there's a lot coming out about that, and that's just really, we're all confirmed. We're all ready to go. So nothing really new.
Okay. Foundation report, Ms. Adolph?
I was just gonna kind of leave it as submitted unless you guys have
Yep.
questions.
Okay.
We don't meet in July, so it's hard.
All right, thank you. And then there's no legislative report.
Now, that doesn't mean the legislator's not busy, but there's
Okay.
no new legislation.
Okay. And then public comment follow-up from June 26.
Yeah, let me, try to pull this together, a couple of things. We had two individuals, Mrs. Brandy Camper and Mrs. Tammy Hayes. And if the board would like me, there's certainly policy documents on both what Mrs. Camper and Mrs. Hayes talked about. So, if you ask me to show anything, I'm happy to do it. But maybe my summary will get us there. Mrs. Camper spoke about something I've dealt with really my whole career, and that's called substitution for physical education. And in the state of Illinois, daily physical education is still a school board requirement. A graduation requirement, excuse me. Policy-wise, state graduation requirements cannot be waived. And meaning you're just out of them, unless they're under very, very specific circumstances. You can waive as a board. You have a local graduation requirement of community service. You as a board, because that's your requirement, you can waive portions of that, all of that, if you saw fit. But state graduation requirements like US history, consumer education, number of years of English, number of years of mathematics, to earn a diploma in the state of Illinois, those have to be followed. Physical education is one of them. And so there is something called substitution for physical education. But the state's very descriptive about the circumstances. There's 5 circumstances where you can substitute another experience for physical education. In particular, what Mrs. Camper spoke about was if you are an 11th grader or a 12th grader and you are participating in interscholastic sports, meaning IHSA sports, the sports we offer here, you can substitute that sport participation when you are in season for a study hall. You can do that. That's allowed under state school code. We document that, we do that. As you might remember, Mrs. Camper mentioned that her daughter is a level 10 high-level gymnast, but participates in club, not an interscholastic sport, not a sport covered in the IHSA. Club sports are outside of that school code, and that was the difficulty. there is no doubt that Mrs. Camper's daughter puts in probably
Mhm.
as much time, maybe more, for sure. 100% right. There's no doubt that gymnastics is a very demanding, physically, emotionally, mentally, sport. No doubt about it. But the fact of the matter is we have many students who are in club sports, hockey, soccer, volleyball, that do not participate with us. And the state doesn't allow us to open the door to have those students not participate in physical education. So I've talked to Mrs. Camper. We're continuing to work. We're looking at her daughter's schedule, the options that do exist, and really just trying to get some common ground where I think all of us, very high-level student, very high-level athlete, that can be very stressful. Can we find some ways to alleviate that stress during the school year? Any questions about
Yeah.
that?
So I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. 3.5 semesters.
One of that is health.
Okay.
So basically 3.5 years of daily physical education and then health goes in there, replaces that.
So 3.5 years?
Yeah, did I write semesters? I
Semesters.
apologize.
That's
Yeah,
why I was
it should be,
confused.
it should be
Okay.
years. That is my error.
Okay, so 3.5 years of daily
Years.
physical education. Got it.
All right, then Mrs. Hayes, spoke for the second time about books with however you describe it, challenging, uncomfortable, objectionable content. And what I really appreciate, I thought she brought to the table that was so valuable for board members were two things, many things, but there were two that I would present to you. One, gave you a very strong description of the novel Push and all the information about Push that Mrs. Hayes had was taken from our online database, which a number of years ago we just made that available to the public. Exactly so a parent like Mrs. Hayes would have access to the reading level of it, the topics in it, related links, short description. You would know exactly what that book is about. So I appreciated that because that kind of gave us as a sense, you as a sense, as a board, that there is access to it. Also, she mentioned, the importance that we're always trying to do is partner with parents. Try to find a solution with parents, whether it's content in the classroom, whether it's in the library. We're always going to try to develop some kind of middle ground. And that was a concern of hers as well. President Lopez Caniva asked me, based on the new legislation, to reach out to our attorney, Todd Hayden, for him to take a look and to see where does that legislation fall in terms of putting labels on books, that books would have objectionable content and I shared with you last week what his opinion is. His opinion, his advice to the board would be that would not align with either the spirit or the letter of that new school code. I independently, on my own, then reached out to the American Library Association because the legislation requires us to align to the American Library Association. They provided some documents which I've shared with the board that speak to labeling as otherwise restricting, and that's language from the law. They see that as a restriction. So that was the research that I did. Ultimately, for the board, we would need some direction from you if you presently would want us to open up our procedures, our library policy, because it is in policy. And because there is a new law, you'd have to have that. I would suggest if there were any revisions the board wanted to see us make, we would have to run that through Todd Hayden. Probably what I would offer, just a few things that can build some common ground. One, we are always interested in connecting with parents. I think having the database, you can look up any book and get extensive information on our database about it. But two considerations. One, much like everything we teach, we put great faith in our math teachers, that they're teaching math, that they're working with parents, our English teachers, our social studies teachers. I have no reason to believe that our media specialists, the two people who lead our two libraries, are anything but compliant with board policy, thoughtful about working with students, supervising their libraries, interacting with kids all the time, responsible for the staffs that work in there with them. I have 100% confidence that if any parent called and wanted a reader list, of books that a child has checked out, wanted a restriction put on certain books, and that's something we do, that they would be responsive, that they'd be in the conversation with parents. So one, much like we trust so many professionals, I just would share with the board a great amount of trust I have in our two media specialists. Second thing, aside from law and policy and school code, that I would ask you to think about quite a bit, is maybe what we heard a little bit earlier today, of the implication of putting a label on a book that might be representative of at least 1, 2, 3, we don't know how many, students' experiences. We don't know if that book might validate a child at our school, her or his experience, and what is the impact of the board putting a label on that. I think it could have a tremendously negative impact, and I wouldn't recommend that any of us. We want to empower parents, we want to give parents, the tools to understand what's happening in our libraries, but at the same time, we want to empower our students and have them see in literature experiences they're having. So questions about any
I
of
have a
that
question.
research? Yeah.
Do the parents know that they do have the right to say, I don't want my child to read this book?
I don't think they do.
Okay.
So we plan on publicizing
That would be my
this
next
year.
one.
And what I'd like to do is move our Destiny database off of the student splash page and move it onto the general website. So it's easy, some of the icons, so it's easier to access. And publicizing that at Welcome Back Days and Freshman Orientation.
I was gonna
And
say,
that was something, in all this work that we learned we can do a better job of.
yes. Because I know when my daughter went here, I never knew that there was such a thing, that you could say, she shouldn't read these type of books or whatever,
Right.
So just as.
Go ahead.
I don't wanna jump in if you still have more to say. So just as a review, if I'm a parent sitting at home and I find out a title that I do not want my child to read, I can go on the database, look it up, see if it's in our library. If I decide that questionable title is something that I don't want them to read, based off of reading the information that's already on the database, all I need to do is contact the media specialist, let them know my child should not check this book out.
And then we would put that on their account, that would be a block.
Yeah, and I guess, I have no interest in revisiting our policy when it comes to this, I don't know how
Exactly.
everybody else feels. But like you said, as long as we're advertising this accessibility to parents, making sure that the link to our database is, visible to them, I have no interest in reviewing.
I just think as long as we let the parents know their rights, I think we should be good.
Yes.
And, it's always a desire to mirror what we do in the classroom. We want parents to weigh in on issues that come up in the classroom. And our libraries exist as a large classroom. And you would expect as a board that we'd be responsive to any parent who's calling with a question. And I appreciate you saying, Mrs. Johnson, publicize that. Let people know what are the processes and procedures they can go through. Like Dr. Shaw said, they have a question. How do they get it answered?
All right, thank you. All right, public comments. At each regular open meeting, members of the public and district employees may address the school board during the public comment section of the agenda. Individuals appearing before the board are expected to respectfully follow the guidelines of Policy 2:230 and Policy 8:30 available upon sign-in. Public comments are important to the board. However, it is customary not to respond on issues until time has been taken to gather information and discuss all options. Lack of action or response does not imply lack of interest in the issues brought to the board. We do have, we have a Miss Jessica Miller. So it's Miss Miller and your daughter,
Yes.
and her
So,
name is?
I'm Jessica Miller, and this is my daughter Charlotte.
Okay, hi Charlotte. Okay,
Okay, so Charlotte will be a freshman this upcoming school year. And the reason that we wanted to come and speak with you tonight was just to express some of our concerns regarding accessibility at the central campus. I know everyone is aware that those are issues, but we thought it actually might be helpful to hear about it from a disabled student's perspective. Charlotte was not comfortable with speaking herself tonight, but we went over all of this together, planned everything together, and do I have the go-ahead to say the things we discussed? Okay. So the first thing we want to say is that so far, we've had some interactions with staff and administration at Central, and those interactions have been nothing but positive and supportive, and we're, really happy about that and feel like she's going to have the support she needs while she's at school there. As everyone knows, the campus was built 114 years ago, and it's really very evident that at the time when the school was built, a student like Charlotte would not be allowed to have an education. The building is not built in a way that would accommodate her. If a building were built after 1993, many of the issues that we see would actually be considered violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The first thing you see is when you come in the main entrance, there's stairs. And that's the main entrance, that's your welcome, that's where you're saying hello. Charlotte comes in and out of door 15, and she told me that she felt incredibly sad because it reminds her that when the building was built, she would not have been able to go to school. From what we've been told, there's one bathroom in the whole building that's really actually accessible, and that's on the first floor. In the library, there's the loft that you can only get to by stairs. People have shared with us that students like to spend time up there. Sometimes teachers take their class up there, but that won't be an option for Charlotte and her classes. When the building was renovated in the 1930s and 50s, it was done so at a different level than what the existing building is. So there are many steep inclines at every floor in the building. Recently, we got Charlotte a motor for her wheelchair that she can be more independent on getting herself around. It doesn't work well on carpet, so that's why I'm helping her out in here, but it will not be safe for her to use that on those steep inclines within the building. It's just too hard to control the speed, and it would be way too much on the motor going uphill. And then someone helping her also brings in safety issues just because you have to use an incredible amount of strength to keep the wheelchair from just going out of control. Charlotte is taking classes in general education. She's also taking honors math and AP human geography. So her classes will be throughout the building. She will be on every floor. We can't limit her classes to one area to make it accessible. So she'll have to rely on the elevator, and it's an old building, old elevator. I don't know if it's always reliable. If it's not working, that will be a disruption to her education. Evacuations are another concern we have. ADA regulations call for having an area for disabled individuals in multi-storied buildings to be able to wait for rescue that is fireproof and smoke-proof. The stairwells are not enclosed at Central, so she would be waiting in an open area, and we've been told she would probably have to be carried down the stairs by a staff member. The doorways are pretty narrow. She has said she went to Fresh Start, enjoyed that, but she said the doorways were difficult to fit through. She made it, but sometimes her right arm might stay out a little extra, and that could pose a risk for her too. Her wheelchair width is 24 inches, and ADA regulation is 32 inches wide. I don't know what the doorways are, but they're probably less than that. We do realize that any of these kinds of things being done to this building would be very costly, and that it's something that would require voter approval. And I know that the voters have turned down recommendations in the past for having a new building built. So I know this is something that has to be presented to the public. And what we are asking, though, is that, oh God, okay, that accessibility be a priority in presenting to the public why this is important. The Americans with Disabilities Act passed 33 years ago, coming up July 26th. And this is really a basic civil rights issue, and that we really need to ask ourselves, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, do we really mean everyone? Do we include people who are disabled? We know Charlotte's resilient, she's gonna get through this year, and it won't be changed in time for her. But it's important enough to us that we wanna know future students with disabilities can come to a school that they know values them like everyone else.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Thank you, Charlotte. Moving on, we have no communications. Our freedom of information request, we only have one. Okay, we're moving on then to our approval items.
And do you
sure.
mind just pausing?
Sure.
Mrs. Lopez Caniva, I did put this up in just board members, just something on FOIA. We don't publish, we publish our FOIA requests, we don't publish our responses, but something I just wanted to share with you is, the purpose of FOIA is to provide the public with documents that we routinely keep that we have. Oftentimes we get FOIA requests that are asking us to make a document, asking us to create something that doesn't exist, or to share personally identifiable information about students or staff members, which obviously we're not compelled to do. We don't keep a document, for example, where we keep your social security number, your date of birth, or other identifiable information. So I just wanted to share that with you, with the nature of FOIA. Where we house documents about you is on our public website. We do have your term of service, when you were elected, were you appointed, and what your biography is. So that is the document that we keep. And so when we respond to a FOIA like this, we say that that document is readily available to the public, to anyone.
Thank you. Because I think there was one point, I think this was years before, when someone also asked that same information. I think it was also.
It is.
So-
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same person or not, but I'm sure. Okay. All right, thank you, Dr. McBride. All right, approval items. Do I have a motion to approve the open session minutes from the June 26, 2023 regular board meeting?
And before you motion, this is unusual, but I spoke with Mr. Borsma last night, who couldn't be here tonight. There was one piece in my report last time about public comment follow-up. I was mentioning prom. And Mr. Borsma, in the minutes, and I did go back and listen, we had part of a sentence where he had talked about safety.
Mm-hmm.
There was a second part of his sentence where he made sort of an illustration where he works oftentimes in construction. Whenever there's a safety issue, they take a pause, they re-examine it to see if it's safe. That was his recommendation, to look like this fall, as we've talked about, surveying students, checking, having a conversation. The board approved prom at Museum of Science and Institute, but he just asked if we could put that additional sentence in. So, as you vote on this, we can, we didn't have time to amend it, to recommend. You could vote on what I just described to you as amended, to add a sentence that Mr. Borisma, going back to it, did say about just his own work in construction. If you're all right to add that, Kathy and I would go ahead and do that. So you'd be voting as amended.
All right.
Minutes as amended. We would reflect these minutes and say that was a suggestion I made.
So I motion to approve the regular minutes from the June 26th meeting as amended, adding in the sentence from Mr. Borsman.
I second that.
Okay. It's been motioned by Dr. Shaw and second by Dr. Shimon Rogers. Roll call.
Navarra,
Yes.
Shimon Rogers,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Shaw,
Abstain.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes. All right, do I have a motion to approve the closed session minutes from the June 26, 2023 regular board meeting? I'll make that motion.
Second?
It's been motioned by Ms. Lopez Caniva and second by Dr. Shaw. Any questions? All right, roll call.
Shimon Rogers,
Yes.
Shaw,
Abstain.
Navarra,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yeah.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes. All right, do I have a motion to approve the July 2023 board member expenses?
So,
All right, it's been motioned by Dr. Shaw and second by Ms. Johnson.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? All right, roll call.
Jamal Rogers,
yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Shaw,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes, all right. Let's see, our treasurer's report and Stephanie Croy.
And as Mrs. Croy comes on up, we spoke just about the agenda. There's really two very important financial pieces to the agenda. One, our typical treasurer's report that contains important documents. Later in the agenda is a request for you to approve the tentative budget. And there is quite a bit of writing that Mrs. Croy did as well about the tentative budget. Well, our lesson plan was to do the treasurer's report, but also give you the background information on the tentative budget while Mrs. Croy is here and while we can refer to some of these documents, because in some ways, these are the root documents that drive the budget. We certainly could do a discussion of the budget when on the approval item, but we thought of just bundling it if that's okay with the
That's
board.
fine.
So Mrs. Croy will do the treasurer's report and we'll start a conversation about the tentative budget.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. All right, the treasurer's report is the last month of the fiscal year. So you'll see if you take a look at our, like our revenue or our expense in the financial reports. So Dr. McBride, do you mind pressing that? Thank you. These are our unaudited, because our audit hasn't occurred yet, June financials, cash balances, statement of position, revenue. I think I've told the board this previously, but I'll mention it again. Cash balances are always high at June 30th because we just collected all of the taxes in May and June for the first half of the 2022 levy and haven't had the time to spend them yet, right? Like those taxes are collected to spend over the next X number of months. So you collect the revenue, but you didn't spend all the money yet, the balances look high. So this is the high water mark, basically, of our cash balances. And Dr. McBride, do you mind scrolling to maybe the expenditures page? As he quickly scrolls, you'll see the cash flow there. High water mark. Keep going, please. Same position, revenue and expenditures. So expenditures, as we're about to talk about budget, this is what the end of the expenditure report looks like for this fiscal year. And you'll see that the budgets, the way this is presented, over to the right is the part that I always look at. I think I was talking to President Caniva. You can see what we've spent compared to the budget, which obviously it's on here every month, but you can see the annual basis at this point, right? How close were we? How much were we under, over, what areas, things like that. For example, in this, the largest discrepancy is the purchase services, which is a big difference that we did not spend. A big part of that was, just off the top of my head, I know there's one thing that was a large difference that we budgeted for and didn't spend as much of. It's all the instructional resources, the electronic resources. I had expected our math resource renewal to be more than it was, and so there's a couple $100,000 more in there for that, for example. And then could you scroll down a little bit further to the bottom so that we can see the totals? So at the very bottom of the budget, you'll see that we've got 93% spent of what we budgeted. Parts of that are skewed though, because just a few lines up, you'll see that our construction projects that we had going on this year, the auditorium got pushed, right? So we didn't finish that up during the year like we were expected to. Otherwise, we would have spent all those capital items. So that 50% where we didn't spend as much of the capital makes the bottom line number look like we didn't spend what we really spent. But back towards the top, it's in the mid-90s to the upper 90s, which means we really did spend most of our operating budget, which is what we expect, right? We expect to be spending that fund. So that leads us into, can you scroll back to the revenue one second as well? So you'll also see in the revenue pieces, it's the same comparison. Now this looks especially wonky for a couple of reasons. In local resources, because of the inflationary, our investment revenue has vastly increased as well. So, you know, we way under budgeted what we were expecting to get in, say, interest and investment income than what we actually got, and that threw us way off.
that's really the biggest piece in a lot of the local resource lines.
Can I ask a question about those capital projects?
Yes.
So we earmarked that money for the auditorium. It wasn't spent this year because it was pushed back. That money is still earmarked to pay for that.
Correct. It's
auditorium
in
the
this year's
upcoming-
budget.
Yes, exactly. So I just
Correct.
wanna make sure the public is aware that that money's not just going to be sitting in a
Nope.
savings account for us to spend on something else. It is still being used for a capital project that we had in our plan.
Absolutely. It's just a timing difference, right? We expected to be further along on the expenditures than we were. The auditorium one is the one I mentioned the most of because we budgeted for that to be done in the winter. And so we, in theory, would have paid for that whole project, but we didn't pay for all of it until some of it being paid now. Now, this year, the bulk of it is gonna be the roof, right? The roofing project, and it is occurring as expected. So we will have, as we go to look at the budget, which we probably, unless there's questions on these other financial reports for June, we can switch to the budget real quick. You will see that we've got capital expenditures of $4 million because it's finishing up the auditorium and it's the 3.9 whatever for the roof.
So, just to make a comment, this is very early on, we're giving you permission tonight to start working on our budget.
Well, actually, back in January.
January, sorry, we did that in
Yeah.
January,
Right.
my apologies.
Yeah,
But what I want board members to be aware of is when it comes time for us to approve this budget, make sure we're asking questions if you have them. We're going to be talking about a levy, we're going to be doing all the things that we do annually, and this is kind of the part where board members need to focus and ask Stephanie the questions.
And this, really what you're approving tonight, you're approving a draft. So what you're really committing to is there's a concept here. There's certain, concepts that are built in, and we'll go over those. There's a set of assumptions that underpin this budget, which then ultimately drives the levy. There's, as you can already gather from what Mrs. Corey presented, there's predicting tax collections, there's predicting investment growth. All that money that came in June is invested, so that we're taking the people's money, we're investing it wisely, it matures monthly, so that we pay ourselves and there's the highest possible yield on those public funds as possible, rather than, for example, just having them in a bank account, right? So you're approving a concept, a draft, and this is the direction that we're taking the budget.
I apologize, draft was what I meant to say. not-
No, you're good, yeah.
Yes, this is a draft of the budget.
tentative is the word that they use in the law, right? So in the Illinois School Code, which is of course the law that we're following, the tentative budget has to be approved 30 days prior to the final budget being approved. We always do it in July so that we don't have to worry about the timing of not having 30 days in between the two meetings. We could always do it in August, but if it doesn't fall correctly, it would require a special meeting and
Right, your
We
August
avoid
board
that,
meeting is closer than 30 days to your
Right.
September.
And so approving the tentative now, which is a rough draft, allows us to make sure that we always meet that requirement and don't ever have a problem. Yes, there are a bunch of assumptions in this budget, just like there were in the financial forecast. Many of them are the same, right? The expenditures are all based on many things that you guys have already approved, collective bargaining agreements, salary increases for non-bargaining staff that were approved in June. Those are all in this document. The salaries for new hires that we've just hired and that are continuing to be hired as we fill the final spots are in here, as well as reductions because those new hires are less than the total people, the salaries of the people that have been here for 30 years that they were replacing, right?
Right, and just to pause for a second, if that's okay, Mrs. Corey, I think there's a very important for board members, a few things that Mrs. Corey mentioned, for example, hiring last month. Every year, really, because we endeavor to do this, we save on hiring. It doesn't mean that, as we have employees exit for retirement or resignation, it doesn't mean that hiring someone who's less experienced is second rate. Second place doesn't mean second rate, but it means we're very astute. So for example, last month, the hiring that we brought to you had about a $300,000 savings. Why are we doing that? You might say, well, why are you doing that? Well, what we're trying to do is hire the same amount of people so that we don't do reductions in programs or increases in class size, and yet be more financially affordable. The other thing Mrs. Corey mentioned is across the board, it's primarily our department chairs that we have to credit quite a bit. Frequently, resources, these are materials, come in under budget, much like Mr. Thompson's work. We just happen to have some very, very financially astute people who are trying to be spendthrifts. And oftentimes we'll budget for work that Mr. Thompson is doing, resources that we hope to acquire, professional development that we hope to attend. And that comes in because people are thrifty, lower than what we thought. So we're always doing that. We're always looking to, within our means, shrink our financial footprint because of some goals we'll mention later that you've given us as well. Sorry to interrupt.
So the savings that Dr. McBride talked about in hiring staff, I do want to point out that that doesn't necessarily mean you'll see the salaries line decrease, right? Because we have hundreds of employees and they all received 4% and 5% contractual increases. So that total, that percentage on the 26 million, that's the salaries in our budget, is more than the $300,000 savings. But it might make it look like that when we look at the total percentage of salary increase, it's 4 instead of 5, right? So that'll all come out, that'll all flush out, but it does, that, the point is, my point is anyway, that while total salaries still go up, we are doing our best to manage where we can and to save where we can, right?
Right. For example, 2 years ago, we worked with the board, we had to make a decision in the middle of the pandemic, whether to negotiate with our union or do what many districts were doing, which was to say, we're in the middle of a pandemic, let's postpone it. Our union was interested in negotiating, we decided we were interested in negotiating, and our settlements came out 4%, 5%. The next year, post-pandemic, unions were bargaining for 8 to 10% increases to meet inflation. So for the board to go out and say, let's negotiate now, that was astute, that helped. I think manage and give us, a great predictive about what will our contracts cost us. So the largest expense we have, which is in salaries, we really, through that inflationary period, knew exactly what to expect. Spoke with a number of superintendents who regretted not bargaining in the pandemic. That was just us all trying to look down the line to see what was coming.
So that being said, salaries and benefits are our largest expense. So the way that this draft budget, the way I drafted this draft budget, is to start with those pieces, right? Start with the salaries and the benefits and add in all of the other pieces from the department chairs that Dr. McBride spoke of, giving me their budgeted expenditures, putting in the capital outlay for these projects, getting Mr. Thompson's budget for what he thinks it's going to cost to run our buildings. All those costs are accumulated, and then I take the pieces of the other revenue separate from the new tax levy that the board has not approved yet, right? The 2023 levy is not approved yet. This budget includes 50% of the 2022, well, 51% of the 2022 levy, because we collected 49% by June 30th. So between that 50% of the 2022 levy and all of the other revenue items, registration fees, state and local grants, or state grants, local donations, other various, rental fees, things like that. The biggest local source is just our personal property replacement tax and registration fees. And then all of the state grants and the federal sources. The federal sources do include our remaining ESSER funds. So this is the last year we'll have ESSER funds. And there's 1.3 or so of ESSER funds in there. Combine all that stuff, then it leaves a hole between here's the expenditures, here's the revenue that we know we were going to have. I have to estimate the 2023 budget in order to fill that hole. Okay, what do we need? So this budget does include the estimate that's explained in the memo, where I'm expecting it to be over 5% again, right? So the CPI that relates to this levy is 6.5%. So even if we levied that, we would be restricted to 5% by law, which is the property tax extension and limitation law. I expect the final levy to look like an approximately 5.96 increase based on new property, right? So if there was 0 new property, it would be 5. But because of my estimate of about $30 million of new property, it'll be closer to 6, which is very similar to what happened this past year.
And if we just, maybe just take a quick time out just to check for understanding, because there's quite a bit in there. Just want to make sure, like Dr. Shaw said, if anybody has questions about the property tax, limitation law, PTEL, that goes both ways. It governs uses consumer price index to help us set our levy. When it's low, we trend down. When it's high, if it goes high last year, 8%, 9% inflation, 6.5% inflation, we can't go above 5%. It's a cap. So it does put a governor on school taxation. And if you think about inflation, if we have a cap, we still have to make up those costs. Those are very real costs. We're seeing that everywhere. Most citizens are seeing inflation when they go to the grocery store. Our grocery store, all the supplies we use, all the people we hire, the materials we want to use, we see that going up, quite a bit. And I guess we do go to the grocery store with our cafeteria, ultimately. So, good to ask questions about the property tax extension limitation law. Another piece is new property. What is that? Why is it capped at 5%? But then Stephanie, wait a minute, just said 5.96 and mentioned new property. And any questions board members have about that. For existing property owners, like all of you at this table, those people who are brand new to the tax rolls, they have a home, they have a business that has never been taxed before. State calls that new property. They help you out. Their first time on the tax rolls, their contribution makes your contribution lighter. Although that, and you would be astute as a Board of Education to bring that tax into the fold. First-time property tax owners, they're new people at the table who are contributing to that civic pot. That's probably a very crude way of explaining it, and Mrs. Croy would do a much better job. Anything to amplify with that, but that new property piece is critical.
But we're also talking about businesses too. So for example, the car dealership that's going in,
Exactly.
the Noodles and Company,
all those.
Sitco when they build over there.
Right, and if Sitco is built over there, our largest single taxpayer, anything new they build helps the entire community because now they have more to give. And just like anything, if 2 of us go out to a very expensive dinner that costs $500, we will have a pricey bill. But if 10 of us go out to a very expensive dinner of $500, it helps all of us out. It's a crude way of explaining a levy, but
One more note on CPI. So while this has been, since I've been in this district, this is it's an extraordinary experience where we've got 2 years of us probably being capped. History, since the property tax extension limitation law has been in place, we've not had that here in this district at all. Like, I'm looking at the list, like the highest before this was 4.1, and that was back in 2008. So this is historic that we've had 2.5%, 2 limitations. All of the other years average 2.3%. So actually, even including last year's 5%, the average is 2.3%. So that's because we've had years where it's been 0.1, and that means we were limited to 0.1, right? So there are years that we can hardly get anything, and we have to figure out how to make do with that, right?
So did you just tell me if I'm interjecting, Mrs. Croy, and that's breaking the flow, but I think a good question for all of you to ask is, you might want to ask, like, well, why levy up to the 5% limit? You might want to ask yourself that question. I would encourage you to ask that question. A second question is that you might ask is, why, if you're levying or creating a budget that then generates a levy, why, if you're levying to that limit, is the tax rate declining? Last year we predicted that the tax rate would actually go down. with that levy. So those would be two good questions asked. Why don't I take the first one? Do you mind taking the second one, or does that break you?
Yeah.
If I went back, and I will if you let me save time, but if you look at our 5-year financial forecast, what we're trying to do is make our increases over time very steady over time. So when you stretch out our expenditures, our budgets over time, they're very flat. We're doing that to achieve a few things that you've asked us to do. One, levying to that 5% allows us to keep 6 to 12 months of cash on hand. For a comparatively small district, what that allows us to do is it insulates us from other economic calamities. It also allows us to do things like maintain fund balances, where when we put a new roof on for $4 million, we renovate an auditorium, those type of expenses. We do that without going for a referendum, as was mentioned earlier in public comment. We're managing that within our own means. We don't have to get a construction grant from the state. We also avoid new debt that's debt tied to operating. If you have debt that's tied to a building, that debt has a physical form. You can see that asset that the community now has, like the back end of this building. You can see it, it's real. Operational, sure, that's real, but that is acquiring debt to operate day to day. It also helps us avoid cutting programs. So, that would be why, we would levy or budget up to that 5%, so we maintain those priorities. This is a really good place, as Dr. Shaw indicated. If we need to rethink over the next 2 months those priorities, now would be the time to ask a lot of questions and rethink those priorities. So I'll maybe throw it to Mrs. Croy. Why is the tax rate continuing to go down up against the type of budget increases we've made?
Well, the tax rate that's really a mathematical question, right? It's really just it's a nature of it. What's the numerator, what's the denominator in division, right? So our levy, our ask, is essentially the numerator, essentially. It turns out into the extension that we're limited to, but our ask, which is limited and then is the extension, is the numerator. And then the denominator is based on the values of the homes, right? The equalized assessed valuation, which is set by the assessor. And it also adds in new property, right? So as that number on the bottom gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and our ask, even though it's bigger, if the bottom grows faster than the top, then the rate goes down, right?
So in essence, the value of property in our attendance area is increasing at a higher rate than the budget increases we're asking for, which ultimately, I think, any fair-minded person would say that's a good thing. I think anybody here who's a property owner in this district would want the value of your property accelerating at a faster rate than any kind of budget that we're asking. Personally, the only time the value of my home dropped precipitously was in the Great Recession, and if I was someone who had economic distress, I'd lost my job, I could not sell my home because its value had dropped so much for what I had paid for my home, and that would have been a calamity. It was for a lot of our fellow citizens. It was a very, very tough time. That's exactly what happened to them. So it's a sign of real health that property values are still increasing at a greater rate than our budget. It's growing just faster than us.
Yeah, and the Great Recession time is the last time that our rates actually did do the opposite, because the EAV had dropped. Assessors were dropping EAV instead of increasing EAV, and when that happens, it throws everything out of whack. Even if our CPI is limiting us, that increase still was not enough to cover a decrease,
So what impact does inflation have?
Well, even from our perspective, on the levy, inflation is affecting CPI, right? So inflation is making that CPI number more than 5%. On our expenditures, inflation it's affecting all of our expenditures, just like it is in your personal expenditures, right? Things that Mr. Thompson's purchasing to repair some of our buildings, clean our buildings, all that stuff, prices are more than they were a year or two ago, right? Probably 2 years ago.
increase in budget.
Right, so some of the expenditure line items are increased just because of that, right? Others we can manage doing other things, and some of them, like some of our energy, Mr. Thompson hedges that, right? Like he purchases energy ahead of time and things like that. So depending on the cost, we can do things to manage it, to kind of control the costs. But some of them are kind of outside of our control. Some of the purchase services are really one of the areas that kind of hits us a little harder. A month or two ago, we approved the ATI contract. I don't remember which, was that in June? I don't remember. That's an example of that.
That's a very good example.
Right, like it's a purchase service, it's a service that we need these athletic trainers at all our practices, and that was a significant increase. Right, those are the kinds of things where we're seeing more increases in purchase services in the area of special education, purchase services in, you know, many of the areas.
Yeah, it's good news, bad news, because core inflation is declining at a more rapid rate than general inflation. So where you see, you know, core inflation are durables, refrigerators, things like that. That inflation is declining. But unfortunately, purchase services, materials, supplies, groceries, disposables are not coming down as quick. And that's what we use the most of, right? Those are the type of things we purchase in bulk.
In some of those areas, we actually have hedged that as well. For example, our audit services, we were in a multi-year agreement with the auditor, and our increases have been small. I am expecting that proposals for the next time around, it'll be an increase, right? And even if I went out for outside, you know, no matter who, whether it's our existing auditor or whether we go to others, it's gonna be an increase, because that's a service that's now gonna play catch up, because they were in agreements, but now they're gonna try and play catch up, which is exactly what happened with ATI, right? Like we were in an agreement, and then, oh, like now all our costs are much higher, we need to charge you more. So, are there any questions on the process, on any of the things that go into this tentative budget?
I appreciate you reiterating what you typed in board docs, and I highly recommend everybody go in there and read it if they have not, because it's a good summary of basically everything you described tonight.
It is just a summary, and of course, more documents will come. The bigger document with all the line items, if you really want to get into that kind of detail, will come in a couple of months. And in August, with the treasurer's report, I can give a couple little, you know, updates on any new developments, if there's anything that's significant. Historically, there's not been a significant change from the tentative budget to the final budget. It's been little things, right? Salaries are adjusted a little bit to finish the hiring. Maybe we've got a little bit more asbestos work in something that happened over the summer that we didn't plan for. Whatever it is, you know, usually it's not significant on a $70 million budget. It's a couple $100,000 here and there, which is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but it's usually not gonna significantly change whether this is a balanced budget, for example, you know.
I know that, you know, I know we have to approve this in September, the final one, but I don't know, we haven't met with facilities and finance, so do you think this committee should really divulge into that budget?
I do,
Or what do
and
you
then
think,
just
maybe
in
in
general, in
August?
committees, maybe a different, but I've talked to Dr. Christofero, Dr. Huntington, Mrs. Corey, we would like to get those committees up and running, sort of July is our new year, so to speak, it's, you know, Happy New Year, everybody. And those are gonna be critical, because curriculum gives a vessel for any citizen who's concerned about curriculum, dig a little bit deeper. Facilities and finance, you know, in my report, I'll talk a little bit about Central, will be critical as well when we're coming into budget season. So for sure.
Okay.
Kind of maybe a final piece, this is our 5-year financial forecast, and just to reiterate, right now, we're only approving the treasurer's report, but later we'll approve the tentative budget. Just one final thing, financially, this you know, flat line that crawls across the top of this, we're using this as a guide because we're always future-minded. It's hard to imagine 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028, but there will be a Lockport Township High School. So we're always conscious that right now in a high inflationary period, if we make decisions that others will have to pay for in a number of years, those holes, that line can start to decline very quickly. So what we're trying to do is to use this budget
to reach those priorities so that even down the line, there is not a sort of seasickness in our finances with our taxpayers and with the school community. That can create a lot of destabilization. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Croy. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for great work.
All right, then, do I have a motion to approve the June 2023 Treasurers Report?
Second?
All right, been motion by Dr. Shimon Rogers and second by Dr. Shaw. Are there any questions to that? Roll call.
Shaw,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Shimon Rogers,
Yes.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes. Okay. Superintendent report.
I think my superintendent report was already made tonight in public comment. First and foremost, we do this month have 2 board members who have birthdays. Ann Lopez Caniva, Veronica Shaw, so happy birthday. We have a lot of birthdays in July in our district office as well, so we're very glad you were born and glad that you're on our board. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really just want to focus my report on just updating you on Central Campus. I think you heard, very eloquently from the Millers. I don't think they would mind since they're here. Me telling a story. The very first in the spring, we've had over 300 people through Central touring it. Very first tour that we did in the spring, Charlotte and her mom came, and it was very dramatic, where you had a young woman who's going to go to our school but couldn't walk into the main entrance of her school. It told a story that I think is very compelling for all of us if we would like to maintain Central as a school building. That's the intent of the community and our intent. We managed, but I don't think anybody felt good about it, because in an ideal world, we'd like Charlotte to walk, right into her school in any way that she wants. So wanted to give you an idea of where we're at. We've gone deeper with DLA, like I mentioned. At this point, a few things. Last month in the discussion you had, you affirmed a number of things. What I was hearing, and I'm just checking for understanding, is you affirmed you're heading towards that strategy of Central as a school building. You also affirmed another important idea of a freshman center, having 7 feeder districts, 2 private schools, probably lots of private schools we don't, even smaller, coming. That station is important to help students become a cohesive class of students, so you believe in that. Based on that, we went a little bit deeper with DLA. We've spent some time meeting with them, and what we're working on right now is, if we did do a preservation and renovation of Central, what is the scope of the work? So there are a few thresholds here. One threshold is just the infrastructure work. HVAC modernization, electrical wiring, accessibility, window replacements, roofing needs. Oftentimes you hear the issues that the Miller spoke about under life safety, right? For Charlotte, she needs a safe space, and students like her, going down that ramp is a real thing. That can be a real unsafe, issue. Washrooms, you name it, all of those issues. So we're looking at that issue. Second issue is used or unused or misused spaces at Central. We've been meeting as an administrative group, and what we're finding is when we cross-section the building, there's a tremendous amount of misused or unused space. And a question I would ask the community, if you're weighing a facilities decision, shouldn't we be using the spaces that we already have that are available, that could be renovated, rather than building new spaces, which are more expensive to build? We've landed on some cost thresholds in terms of the scope. Low end would be $31 million. High end would be, if you just, everything you could dream of, $95 million. This morning I was at East Leiden High School. It's a vintage building, same historicity for Melrose Park and Franklin Park. as Central, they had an opportunity, there was property available right across the street, where they easily could have built a new high school and chose instead to renovate East Lyden, and they were managing similar issues that we're managing, as well as some issues at West Lyden. They did about $100 million worth of work combined, but again, the driving force in their community was much less expensive than new construction.
And that was what I wanted to touch on, just for the public's knowledge. We're talking renovation, which is less costly. I believe you asked what a new building would cost. Do you recall what that number was?
Somewhere between about now, what DLA informed us, if you go by the square footage, here's what it would depend on. Would the district build a brand new freshman center? Which in some ways might be short-sighted, because if our demographics ever changed, you wouldn't want to build a building with limits, so you almost would be forced to build. So a brand new freshman center would probably cost about $150 to $165 million. If you built a brand new 9 through 12, that's probably going to be in the range of $180 to $200 million.
So double.
Double. So at least double of the range that we would propose for renovations.
And then at least I know also for the public to know that if we do go into that, route of building a new high school, then becomes the question of what's gonna happen to Central.
Right, you still, as a Board of Education.
We would own it.
You would own it. And
Yes.
many of the issues that you have as a building, the accessibility that we heard earlier this evening, the heating and cooling, the wiring, those issues would still be issues for you, depending on what you would do with it. I do have to say, I wish I had Mr. Thompson. I walked into the major mechanical room at East Lyden today, all brand new major mechanicals, and anyone who went into Central would immediately understand the difference. They replaced 70-year-old boilers and mechanicals, more modern, more efficient boilers and mechanicals that have made a huge difference there.
Has Central been deemed a historical landmark?
We had a thumbnail. We have a member of our committee who is also part of city planning for the city of Lockport, Lance Teese. He believes that really only the Veterans Foyer and the main gym would qualify for landmark status.
So those things could,
You
for
can get
public to
grants.
say, let's tear it down and build something new in that location could not occur because of
Yeah, you
those
might have some
reasons.
pushback, right? Yeah, you might have some pushback.
A lot of issues.
And I think you gotta keep it such simple. You as a board need an answer. If we would like Central to continue on as a school, then there are things in a modern era that we would have to do to that building to make it a proper school for all students. And the scope of that is obviously up for debate. I'm not suggesting tonight isn't a recommendation to, budget $95 million, but it gives you a sense. 31 million would probably take us through all of that major infrastructure work. But as you know, we had a citizens committee that said, why would we do that and not look very carefully? At East Lyden today, they had issues just like Central. They had a subterranean basement cafeteria. If you want to see the pictures, you'll be reminiscent of Central. But what they did is they opened up a more multi-purpose site that's a student center, an auditorium center, a cafeteria, brighter light, brought light in, but just a more proper place. So that's my report.
Yes. All right, thank you. All right, we have no curriculum report, no principal report, and overnight field trip, we only have one there.
It's just 4 minutes in the fall, going downstate, Edwardsville.
All right, and maintenance report.
Mr. Thompson and his staff have been really enjoying summer, taking off as much
Oh
time
yeah,
as they
there's a
can.
big long list there, a long list of everything.
Yeah,
was
I
just
don't
like,
think
ooh.
this list, I did at home see if I could read every item off as quickly as possible, but you just get a sense. This illustrates two things. One, how busy Mr. Thompson's staff is and how much is getting done. It's an incredible amount. So number one, this is what we're doing. Earlier tonight, you heard from some students who mentioned, not being able to hear intercoms. Well, replace 132 classroom intercom speakers. So all of the things, many of them hidden to the common view that prepare us for the school year at Easton Central are being done right this minute. If you take a look at these, you really also get what we just talked about in the budget, all the disposables that are involved here. That are being replaced out, all the small parts that aren't so small when they're a fire alarm panel, for example. But those parts are expensive because they have expensive components.
I know Mr. Thompson had, developed a life safety, list. As we do these projects, are we knocking them off of there?
We are knocking them off. Now, not
Not like we want to?
some of the major things, some of the most major life safety. For example, I would say the roof that we're doing here, that's a major life safety. We're able to knock some of those off. In many ways, we are handling these because if you look down, many of them are, like when you install a new fire alarm panel, that's major life safety. To do a proper job, for example, at Central, you'd have to have a more major effort. Anything on life safety, Bill, that you want to mention?
Yeah, no, I mean, every 10 years, the survey is done and we get a list which is required and recommended. And all the required stuff is done and we're working, over the next 6, 7, 8 years, getting the recommended and other things on the list done. So, yeah, so we look at it every year and we do. We take care of certain things every year.
And some of this, for example, we were just talking last week, we had our annual building inspections, the Regional Office of Education does that, other inspectors do that. And there were some things we just had to do, had to get done. We're directed to do that, we have to do that.
Like the sprinkler heads in the pool, which we're doing next week, those are
Right.
on the list, which, is getting done next week.
Just have to be done. All right.
That's good.
Do you have a question?
I said, that's good.
Oh, that's good, okay.
I remember what's having this multi-page list.
You like, Ms. Johnson, you like checking things off the list. I
Right.
can tell.
That's true. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. All right, consent agenda items. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda items 2 through number 8?
So moved.
It's been motioned by Dr. Shaw and second by Dr. Shimon Rogers. Are there any questions? All right, hearing none, roll call.
Johnson,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Shaw,
Yes.
Shimon Rogers. Yes. Lopez Caniva.
Yes. All right, do I have a motion to approve the LTHS Emergency E-Learning Plan?
So moved.
I can second that. All right, it's been motioned by Dr. Shaw and second by Ms. Lopez Caniva. Are there any questions? All right, roll call.
Johnson,
Yes.
Shaw,
Yes.
Navarro,
Yes.
Shimon Rogers. Yes. Lopez Caniva.
Yes. Do I have a motion to approve the 2023-2024 tentative budget? And I can second that. It's been motioned by Dr. Shimon Rogers and second by Ms. Lopez Caniva. Are there any questions? All right, roll call.
Navarro,
Yes.
Shimon Rogers.
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Shaw,
Yes.
Lopez Caniva.
Yes. All right, there's no policy updates. Okay. Do I have a motion to enter into closed session to confidentially discuss confidential discussion on the selection of a person to fill a public office as defined in the Open Meetings Act, including a vacancy in a public office when the public body is giving power to appoint under law or ordinance, or the discipline, performance, or removal of the occupant of a public office, when the public body is given power to remove the occupant under law or ordinance under Chapter 5 of the ILCS 120/2C3, and litigation when an action against, affecting, or on behalf of the particular public body has been filed and is pending before a court or administrative tribunal, or when the public body finds that an action is probable or imminent, in which case the basis for the finding shall be recorded and entered into the minutes of the closed session under Chapter 5 of the ILCS 120/2C11.
So moved.
All right, it's been motioned by Dr. Shaw, second by Dr. Shimon Rogers. Roll call.
Shimon Rogers? Yes. Shaw?
Yes.
Navarro?
Is it too, I just wanna make an interjection, is it too late to make the announcements?
For what?
Just skip around, because if we're just gonna go into closed session at the end of it, we still have to make like the closing items announcements.
Well, we still have to come out of, closed session.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
The meeting needs to be ended in public.
Yeah.
That's when we do the minutes.
Alright, I just was
Proceed,
wondering.
yeah, it's, I understand where you're coming from.
It's a little
Yeah, just
awkward,
proceed.
but I
Mhm.
guess it can't be helped.
Yeah.
Yes,
Johnson?
Yes.
Lopez Caniva?
Yes. All right, time regular session ends at 8:15. Does anyone want a break or anything before we go into
I'm
closed?
gonna run to the restroom.
Sure,
Me too.
okay, we'll take a little few minutes break.